NVIDIA detailed more of its Volta architecture yesterday, a name that we first covered in 2015, where Volta was shown as targeted for 2018 delivery. NVIDIA seems to be on target for 2018, with its initial server-grade Tesla V100 accelerators shipping in DGX servers by Q3 of this year. V100 is a major architecture milestone for NVIDIA and marks a divergence from architectures that more closely resemble the likes of Kepler, Maxwell, and Pascal. Today, we're detailing the initial V100 layout. Before that, this video is brought to you by Corsair's new Vengeance RGB LED RAM, which ships with custom screened ICs for better overclocking performance and stability. Given that memory is highly relevant for performance with new Ryzen CPUs, now is a good time to do research on high-performance kits. Start with the Vengeance RGB LED kit at the link in the description below. V100 is not a consumer product, just like P100 was not, but eventually we'll probably have something like V102, which will be consumer targeted and would effectively be an 1180 Ti if we were to take today's nomenclature. And it looks like NVIDIA is on target for a 2018 delivery of potential consumer-grade Volta architecture implementation on video cards that would be in the gaming market. For today, we're looking at the initial Volta architecture that includes things like the new Tensor Cores, which are not really something that gamers will be able to make use of, but are critical to business operations, deep learning, HPC, all kinds of things that involve data-heavy crunching and compute, whereas later graphics versions of Volta will change in their organization somewhat, just like with Pascal. P100 was 64 cores per SM, whereas the 102 chips and all the other consumer chips were 128 cores per SM. So there's a bit of difference between compute and graphics products, but the base architecture is the same. So we can start with V100 and see what it looks like today. Starting with the block diagram, this is the full-size V100 block diagram as built atop one of the largest pieces of silicon we've seen on a GPU. The die size for V100 is 815 millimeters squared, around 30% larger than P100's already large 610 millimeters squared. For comparison, consumer-grade 1080 Ti GP102 chips are 471 millimeters squared, just to give some perspective. Full V100 hosts 5376 FP32 CUDA cores across 84 SMs, using similar organizational hierarchy to the GP100 at 64 cores per SM, with a 1:2 FP64 ratio and 2:1 FP16 ratio. The result is 15 teraflops of single precision compute, about 8 teraflops of double precision, and about 30 teraflops of FP16, or half precision compute. For deep learning, FP16 is useful as the precision is not needed when working with such large data matrices. Despite similar organizational layout to P100, the actual architecture is vastly different. Scheduling and thread execution, for example, have been reinvented with V100, but we don't really know how just yet. And the introduction of Tensor Cores complicates things. So alongside the 5376 CUDA cores, which we're fairly familiar with at this point, there are also 672 Tensor Cores. These are the new ones. Each SM holds 8 Tensor Cores, just like each SM holds 64 CUDA cores, and a Tensor Core is targeted at HPC, deep learning, machine-type neural net applications, whereas CUDA cores are more known. They can work and apply to all of these things, especially with FP16 towards deep learning. But Tensor Cores are special, and that's because they are a cluster of ALUs in a single core. So it's a single unit that specializes in FMA operations, or fuse, multiply, add, and it can execute those operations across two 4x4 matrices. What does that mean? Well, it means that each Tensor Core can execute 64 FMAs per clock. So 64 fuse, multiply, add operations per clock of a single Tensor Core, which means that you're roughly quadrupling what a previous CUDA core could do in the same amount of time, one clock cycle in terms of FMA operations. So that is helpful for compute work. It's helpful, again, for deep learning. It's a huge deal in that regard. For us, gaming, not really something we care about right now anyway. Nothing that we can see an immediate use for, but that doesn't mean it's irrelevant. It's obviously a huge deal for the Volta architecture, Tensor, quadrupling CUDA core execution throughput in terms of flops per clock for those server-side, very expensive money-driving businesses. That's a big deal. So that's the main thing with V100 that NVIDIA was talking about at their event. Tensor Cores are something to pay attention to, but not something that you need to worry about as a consumer anytime soon. Here's a shot of the SM layout. Each SM contains 2 TPCs that contain blocks of FP64, FP32 int, and Tensor Core units, just like always, except for the addition of Tensor Cores. This is just a block diagram and not necessarily representative of actual die space allocation to the Tensor Cores, but it's looking like a large part of the die space of V100 is allocated to this new type of core. The usual 4 TMUs are present on each SM, totaling 336 TMUs across 84 streaming multiprocessors to P100's 240 TMUs across 60 SMs. These are indicated by the text marks on the bottom of the diagram, and that's again an SM layout diagram, whereas the block diagram shows them all working together. The architecture will be built on a new 12 nanometer FinFET process, which NVIDIA and TSMC, they stick the name NVIDIA on it, so it's FinFET NVIDIA, which is just special optimizations that we don't know about made to the process by TSMC. So 12 nanometers, it's a completely new architecture. This isn't Pascal based, it's not Maxwell or Kepler based or anything like that. And the die size, again, at 815 millimeters squared, totaling 21.1 billion transistors, that is at the reticle limit for what TSMC can manufacture. So that is the absolute hard limit of their manufacturing tools, the physical tools in the factory, the fab, I should say. You can't really get bigger than that right now. And when die size increases on GPUs, if you're not aware, it generally means yield goes down. This is just part of why the bigger GPUs, like something you'd find on a 1080 Ti, are more expensive than the smaller ones, which are physically smaller. Yield goes down, so cost goes up. Because there's greater risk involved, you lose more of your silicon each run you're doing of the wafers. So that drives up cost, but for consumers, it eventually comes down our way, because as these large enterprise B2B type operations pay for the new technology because they can really benefit from it, the cost goes down, the yields go up, the die size eventually shrinks a bit for something like an 1180 Ti or whatever it may be in the future. That's why you normally see these GPUs on gaming grade cards smaller than the accelerated cards. The V100 Accelerator is the first product shipping with Volta architecture. It is a cut down version of the V100 block diagram that we just went through. Not that cut down, it's 5120 CUDA cores rather than the 5376 that the full Volta block is capable of from what we've seen so far. So it's a little cut down, but not much. And then it is HBM2 supported, just like the GP100 Accelerator was. That would be the previous Tesla card, high-end Tesla card. And HBM2 here is limited to 16 gigabytes. They can't go higher until someone can manufacture HBM with a greater count of dies per stack. And because NVIDIA is sticking to 4 stacks for this new GPU, just like for GP100 accelerators, that means they're limited to 16 gigabytes of HBM2. It's still a 4096-bit bus, just like GP100 was, but the efficiency has gone up from what they've said, and we don't really have a whole lot of information on Volta at a low level just yet. We've got a decent amount of starter information, but efficiency should have gone up. That also means that there could be a change in per core efficiency, which is something we've seen in past architectures. For example, Kepler to Maxwell, there was something like a 30% increase in performance per watt out of the cores, or just efficiency overall, which means that you can't always compare just raw core count cross architecture, even from the same manufacturer, because those cores might be physically capable of a different amount of throughput or different operations or whatever, depending on which arc you're looking at, how old it is, things like that. So there are optimizations, of course. We don't know the details just yet, other than top level things like thread execution and organization have changed, but no real details to speak of right now. That said, they should be coming out pretty soon, because white papers for these new architectures normally get pushed pretty shortly after the GTC event, which is where this was announced and is in the process of concluding this weekend. So a consumer target looks like next year is pretty likely 2018. That's what NVIDIA has said all along for the most part, so that's not changed. If you're in the server business and for some reason watching us, then I guess the thing for you to know would be that this V100 accelerator costs $18,000 standalone, or you can buy a server, a DGX server, which it's got the full specs online on their site. That's $150,000, and it means you get them earlier, Q3. But if you're in the business of making money off these things, I guess getting it earlier is probably something that would make you money, but that's not really our territory. So we'll wait for Volta on consumer products. But as more information on V100 comes out, we'll deep dive it just like we did with GP100. And of course, Vega is theoretically happening at some point, so we'll stay tuned for that as well. Thank you for watching. As always, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out with this type of reporting, or you can go to store.gamersnexus.net, where we've got shirts like this one or the Graph logo shirt, now restocked in cotton. Subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.